Daniel pulled his truck into the gravel driveway and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the house through the dusty windshield. The old Victorian looked tired, really tired. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, leaving patches of bare wood exposed to the weather. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, and the garden that his mom had spent countless hours tending was now a jungle of weeds and overgrown shrubs. But it was still home. Even after 20 years away, even with all the damage time had done, Daniel could still see it the way it used to be. He could practically smell his dad's weekend barbecues and hear his mom calling him in for dinner from that very porch. He stepped out of the truck and took a deep breath. The air smelled different than he remembered, cleaner somehow, but less familiar. That's when he noticed them. Houses, lots of houses. Where there used to be empty fields and scattered farms, there were now rows of identical homes, each one looking like a carbon copy of the next. Beige siding, brown trim, perfectly cut grass, and not a single fence or decoration out of place. His family's old Victorian sat like a forgotten relic in the middle of all this sameness, perched on its original 2 acres of land. The contrast was jarring. While every other house looked like it had rolled off an assembly line last week, his place looked like it had survived a war. Daniel walked around the property, his boots crunching on the gravel. The old oak tree where he'd built a treehouse was still standing, though the treehouse itself had collapsed years ago. The barn his grandfather had built in the 50s was listing to one side. Its red paint faded to a dusty pink. Everything felt smaller than he remembered, the way childhood places always do when you return as an adult. He'd been 38 when the estate finally cleared. 3 years of paperwork, lawyers, and waiting, while the house sat empty after both his parents passed. 3 years of watching from across the country as the place slowly fell apart. He'd wanted to come back sooner, but life had gotten in the way. A demanding job, bills to pay, responsibilities that kept him chained to a desk in a city he'd never really liked. Then one morning, he'd woken up and realized he was living someone else's life. He'd quit his job that same week, packed everything he owned, and headed back to restore the only place that had ever really felt like his. Daniel was pulling boxes out of the truck when he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him. He turned to find a woman walking toward him from across the street. She was wearing tennis whites, had her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Hello there," she called out, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You must be the new owner. I'm Patricia Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. Welcome to the neighborhood." Daniel wiped his hand on his jeans and shook hers. "Daniel Chen. Thanks, but I'm not exactly new. I grew up here." Patricia's smile faltered for just a second. "Oh, how wonderful. Well, things have certainly changed since then. We've really built up a lovely community here." She thrust a thick packet of papers at him. "This is your welcome packet. It has all our community guidelines, architectural standards, and the fee schedule. You'll want to review it carefully." Daniel took the packet but didn't open it. "I appreciate it, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. This property isn't part of the HOA. My family's land was here long before any of these houses were built." Patricia laughed, a sharp sound that reminded Daniel of breaking glass. "Oh, I think you'll find that all properties in this area are part of Meadowbrook Heights. It's in everyone's best interest to maintain community standards. We can discuss the details later. I'm sure you'll want to get settled first." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at the house, her nose wrinkling slightly. "You'll probably want to prioritize the exterior. We have approved color palettes that would really help the property blend in better with the neighborhood aesthetic. I'll have someone drop off the paint charts." Before Daniel could respond, she was already walking away, her white tennis shoes bright against the asphalt. He looked down at the packet in his hands, then back at his house. Blend in? This place had stood here since 1923. These cookie-cutter houses had been here for maybe 15 years at most. Why should his home have to blend in with them? He tossed the packet onto the front seat of his truck and went back to unloading. He had work to do. Over the next few days, Daniel started to understand the scale of what he'd taken on. The house needed everything. New roof, new plumbing, rewiring, foundation work, and that was just the beginning. But he'd saved up enough money to take 6 months off, and he was determined to do this right. He started hiring contractors, focusing on finding people who understood old houses. Not the kind who wanted to gut everything and install modern fixtures, but craftsmen who appreciated the original details and knew how to restore them properly. He got lucky when he found Tom, a carpenter in his 60s, who'd actually done work for Daniel's parents back in the day. "I remember this place," Tom said, running his hand along the doorframe. "Your dad and I rebuilt this porch together one summer. He was so particular about getting the angles just right." He looked at Daniel. "We can bring her back. It'll take time and it won't be cheap, but we can make her beautiful again." They started with the structure, fixing the foundation and replacing rotted beams. Daniel worked alongside Tom and his crew whenever he could, learning as he went. His hands, soft from years of keyboard work, developed calluses. His back ached every night. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work, about literally rebuilding his past with his own hands. As they worked, Daniel became more aware of the neighborhood around him. People would slow down as they drove past, staring at the work being done. Some waved, others just looked and kept going. He noticed that every single house on the surrounding streets looked almost identical. Same colors, same mailboxes, same landscaping. Even the cars in the driveways seemed to come from the same limited selection. One evening, an older couple stopped while he was working in the yard. The man was probably in his 70s with kind eyes and weathered hands that suggested he'd done manual labor most of his life. "Good to see someone fixing up the old place," the man said. "I'm Frank Johnson. This is my wife Helen. We live 3 streets over." Daniel Chen. "This was my parents' house." Helen smiled warmly. "I remember your mother. She used to bring vegetables from her garden to the community center. Such a kind woman." They chatted for a while, and Daniel learned that the Johnsons had been among the first to buy in the neighborhood when it was developed. "It was different then," Frank said quietly. "The HOA was supposed to just handle the common areas and make sure people didn't paint their houses bright purple or let their yards go to seed. Somewhere along the way, it became something else." There was something in the way he said it that made Daniel pause. But before he could ask more, Helen gently tugged her husband's arm. "We should let you get back to work. If you need anything, don't hesitate to knock on our door." As they walked away, Daniel watched them go, wondering what Frank had meant. He'd soon find out that life in Meadowbrook Heights was far more complicated than it looked from the outside. 3 months into the restoration, the house was finally starting to look like itself again. Daniel had spent countless hours stripping away layers of old paint, revealing the original wood underneath. The craftsmanship from nearly a century ago was stunning. Every joint was perfectly fitted, every detail carefully considered. They didn't build houses like this anymore. Tom had helped him rebuild the wraparound porch exactly as it had been, using period-appropriate techniques and materials. They'd even tracked down the original architectural plans at the county records office to make sure every detail was right. The spindles, the railings, the decorative brackets, everything matched the 1923 design. Now came the fun part, choosing colors. Daniel had done his research, poring over old photographs and historical records. Victorian homes from this era were meant to be colorful, to show off all those architectural details. He settled on a deep forest green for the body of the house with cream-colored trim and burgundy accents for the gingerbread details. It was bold, but it was historically accurate, and more importantly, it honored what the house was meant to be. When the painters finished, Daniel stood across the street to take it all in. The house looked alive again. The green made it stand out against the landscape in the best way, and the cream trim highlighted every beautiful detail his great-grandfather had chosen when he'd built the place. It was perfect. His neighbors, however, didn't seem to agree. The first letter arrived 2 days after the paint job was complete. Daniel found it tucked into his screen door, an official-looking envelope with the Meadowbrook Heights HOA logo embossed on the front. The letter informed him that his paint colors were not on the approved list and violated community standards. He had 30 days to repaint the house in approved neutral tones, specifically beige, tan, gray, or white. Failure to comply would result in fines of $100 per day. Daniel read the letter twice, then laughed out loud. They couldn't be serious. He pulled out his property deed, the survey and all. The historical documentation he'd gathered. His property line was clearly marked. His land had never been part of the HOA. He wasn't subject to their rules any more than someone living in the next town over. He wrote a polite response explaining this, attached copies of all his documentation, and sent it back certified mail. Problem solved, he thought. He was wrong. The next letter came a week later, this time demanding he remove his garden fence. Daniel hadn't put up a garden fence. The fence had been there since the 1950s, built by his grandfather to keep deer out of the vegetable garden. It was a simple split-rail fence, weathered gray with age, and it marked the boundary of what had been his mother's pride and joy. Speaking of the garden, Daniel had been working to restore that too. He'd found some of his mother's old seed packets in the potting shed, labels written in her careful handwriting. Many of them were heirloom varieties that had been passed down through the family. He'd planted everything, adding perennials he remembered from his childhood. Her rose garden was coming back to life, with careful pruning bringing the old bushes back to health. This letter also mentioned 3 years of back HOA dues, plus late fees and legal fees, totaling just over $15,000. The amount was absurd. The property had been vacant during those 3 years, tied up in estate proceedings. Even if he had owed dues, which he didn't, how could they justify that amount? Daniel called the number on the letterhead. A pleasant-voiced woman answered.
Meadowbrook Heights HOA, how may I help you?
This is Daniel Chen. I've received letters about violations and dues, but my property isn't part of the HOA. I've already sent documentation proving this. Let me transfer you to Mrs. Whitmore. The hold music was interrupted by Patricia's crisp voice. Mr. Chen, we've reviewed your documentation. However, your property is surrounded by HOA properties and benefits from our neighborhood standards. We've consulted with our attorney and he believes we have a strong case for inclusion. A case for inclusion? My land was here first. Your neighborhood was built around it. Nevertheless, you're impacting property values with your non-conforming choices. We need to maintain consistency. Mrs. Whitmore, with all due respect, I'm not part of your association. I won't be paying dues or following rules that don't apply to me. There was a long pause. We'll be in touch, Mr. Chen. She hung up. Daniel stared at the phone, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. The harassment started small. Patricia began showing up unannounced, always with another board member as a witness. They'd walk around his property with cameras, taking pictures of everything. The fence, the paint colors, the garden, even the placement of his truck in the driveway. Just documenting violations, Patricia would say with that same tight smile. There are no violations. You have no authority here. We'll see what the courts say about that. Then came the complaints to the county. Someone reported unpermitted work being done on the property. The county inspector showed up looking apologetic. I'm sure this is nothing, the inspector said, but we have to check out every complaint. Do you have your permits? Daniel produced the entire folder. Every single permit properly filed and approved. The inspector looked them over, signed off on everything, and left. But it cost Daniel half a day of work. The next week, code enforcement showed up about an alleged zoning violation. Again, Daniel had to stop work, pull out all his documentation, and prove he wasn't doing anything wrong. Again, the inspector found nothing amiss and seemed embarrassed to be there. Between you and me, the inspector said quietly as he was leaving, someone's calling in a lot of complaints about this address. Just so you know. It happened 3 more times over the next month. Different complaints, different inspectors, same result. Nothing was wrong. But each visit disrupted the work and cost money and lost time. Then the letters started arriving at his contractors' addresses. Tom showed him one at lunch one day. It was on HOA letterhead and claimed that Daniel's property was in violation of multiple covenants and delinquent on dues. It threatened any contractor working on the property with trespassing charges and legal action for aiding in violations. It's garbage, Tom said, crumpling the letter. But I'll be honest with you, Daniel. Some of my guys are spooked. They've got families, and they can't afford legal trouble even if these threats are bogus. Daniel lost 2 workers that week. Good men who needed the work but couldn't risk it. He didn't blame them. Patricia was creating an atmosphere of fear, using official-looking letters and legal language to intimidate people who couldn't afford to fight back. The anonymous notes started appearing in his mailbox. Nothing threatening enough to take to the police, just unpleasant. Be a good neighbor. Stop causing problems. We were fine before you came back. They weren't signed, but Daniel had his suspicions about where they came from. What really got under his skin was how Patricia kept referring to his property as delinquent and himself as non-compliant, as if he was breaking rules that applied to him. She was creating a narrative that he was the problem, that his beautiful restoration was somehow harming the community. One evening, Daniel saw a notice posted at the community center about a neighborhood meeting. The topic was listed as property standards and community values. His name wasn't mentioned, but he knew exactly what it was about. He showed up anyway, walking into a room full of his neighbors. Patricia stood at the front mid-presentation. She looked startled when she saw him, but recovered quickly. "Oh, Mr. Chen, this is a members-only meeting. It's in a public community center and it's about my property. I'm staying." He took a seat in the back. Patricia continued, but he could see her jaw tighten. She pulled up photos of his house on a projector, talking about how non-conforming properties could impact everyone's home values. She had charts, statistics, and a petition she was passing around to support legal action to enforce community standards. When she finished, Daniel stood up. Every head in the room turned. "I'd like to say something if that's okay." Patricia looked like she wanted to refuse, but too many people were watching. "Make it brief." Daniel walked to the front, pulling papers from his bag. "Mrs. Whitmore has been telling you that my property is violating HOA rules." "That's not true. My family's land was here decades before this neighborhood existed." He held up the survey. "Here's the proof. My property line has never been part of the HOA. Never." He distributed copies to people in the front row. "She's been filing false complaints, harassing my contractors, and trying to force me into an association I was never part of. My house isn't lowering your property values. I've invested everything I have into restoring it properly and historically. What's lowering property values is this constant harassment and the fear it's creating." He looked around the room. Some people were reading the documents. Others looked uncomfortable. A few were nodding. "I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to honor my family's home." As he sat down, Frank Johnson stood up from the other side of the room. "I'd like to say something too." His wife tried to pull him back down, but he gently moved her hand away. "My wife and I have lived here for 15 years. We've paid every fee, followed every rule, and kept our mouths shut when things didn't seem right. But I'm tired of being quiet." He looked at Patricia. 3 years ago, we planted a vegetable garden in our backyard. Just tomatoes and peppers like my dad taught me to grow. The HOA fined us $5,000 for non-approved landscaping and threatened to put a lien on our house if we didn't tear it out. We couldn't afford to fight, so we tore it out. The room had gone completely silent. "I'm tired of being afraid in my own home," Frank continued, "and I'm tired of watching good people get bullied." Daniel's right. Maybe it's time we all stood up. Patricia's face had gone red. "This meeting is adjourned." But people weren't leaving. They were gathering around Daniel, looking at his documents. Some were sharing their own stories. A younger couple talked about being fined for painting their front door blue instead of approved brown. An elderly woman mentioned being threatened over a bird feeder. As Daniel left that night, 3 people asked for copies of his documentation. Frank and Helen walked out with him. "Thank you for speaking up," Daniel said. Frank shook his head. "Should have done it years ago, but maybe it's not too late to make things right." Daniel went home that night feeling like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight. But he also knew that Patricia wasn't going to back down easily. If anything, tonight had probably made her more determined. He was right. The lawsuit arrived the following week. The envelope was thick, official, and impossible to ignore. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the morning coffee forgotten as he read through the lawsuit the HOA had filed against him. They were claiming his property created a visual nuisance that diminished neighborhood property values. They wanted a court order forcing him to comply with HOA standards or face daily fines of $500 until he did. $500 a day for paint colors and a garden fence that had existed longer than most of the people in the neighborhood had been alive. Daniel felt his hands shake as he read, not from fear but from anger. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about control. about forcing everyone into the same mold regardless of history or individual rights. He called every lawyer in the phone book that morning. Most gave him the same advice: just pay the HOA, repaint the house, and make the problem go away. It would be cheaper than fighting, but I'm not wrong, Daniel kept saying. My property isn't part of their association. Doesn't matter, one lawyer told him bluntly. Fighting an HOA is expensive, time-consuming, and exhausting. Even if you win, you lose. You still have to live next to these people. But Daniel wasn't ready to give up. He kept calling until he found someone willing to listen. Her name was Rebecca Ford, and she specialized in property rights cases. Come to my office tomorrow, she said after hearing his story. Bring everything you have. Every document, every letter, every piece of evidence. He showed up with 2 boxes full of papers. Rebecca spent 3 hours going through everything, making notes, asking questions. She was in her 50s with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. They don't have a case. Your documentation is solid. But I need to be honest with you, Daniel. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. HOAs have money and they're used to people backing down. They'll try to bury you in paperwork and legal fees. I'm not backing down, she smiled. Good. Because I think there's more going on here than just an HOA power trip. Let me do some digging. While Rebecca started building his legal defense, the harassment at home intensified. Patricia seemed to take the lawsuit as permission to escalate everything. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning. Daniel was working in the garden when a landscaping truck pulled up. 3 men got out and started measuring his front yard. Can I help you? Daniel called out. We're here to assess the property for the HOA, one of them said, not looking up from his measuring tape. This property isn't part of the HOA, you're trespassing. The man finally looked at him. We have a work order from Mrs. Whitmore. She said this is HOA property. She lied. This is private property. You need to leave. They argued for 10 minutes before Daniel had to threaten to call the police. They left, but not before Patricia herself showed up, clipboard in hand. Those men were here to help you maintain community standards, she said. I don't need or want your help, and for the last time, I'm not part of your community. The courts will decide that. Until then, I'm documenting every violation. She started taking pictures again, walking around his property like she owned it. You're trespassing. I'm on HOA business. On my private property. Leave or I'm calling the police. She left, but the smile on her face told Daniel this was exactly the confrontation she'd wanted. She was probably documenting his hostile behavior for the lawsuit. The next week, his mail started going missing. Not all of it, just certain pieces. Bills would arrive weeks late. Letters from Rebecca would disappear entirely, requiring her to send duplicates by courier. Daniel filed a complaint with the post office, but they couldn't find any proof of wrongdoing. Then his internet service was mysteriously discontinued. The company claimed he'd called to cancel. He hadn't. It took 3 days to get it reconnected. 3 days when he couldn't work on the research he was doing for his own defense. His truck was towed from his own driveway one night. The towing company said they'd received a call about an abandoned vehicle on HOA property. It cost him $200 and half a day to get it back. Each incident was small enough to seem like maybe just a mistake, but together they formed a clear pattern. Someone was trying to make his life miserable, hoping he'd give up and move away. The anonymous notes got worse too. You're not welcome here. Leave before you regret it. Accidents happen to people who don't fit in. That last one made him call the police. But without a signature or witnesses, there was nothing they could do. Keep the notes, the officer advised. If this escalates to actual threats or violence, these will help establish a pattern of harassment. If it escalates, the words stuck with Daniel. How much worse could this get? He got his answer when Tom called him one morning, his voice tight. Daniel, I need to tell you something. Patricia Whitmore contacted me yesterday. She offered me $10,000 to walk away from your project and testify that you'd been doing unpermitted work. Daniel felt his stomach drop. What did you say? I told her where she could shove her money. But Daniel, this is serious. She's trying to manufacture evidence against you. Did you record the conversation? No, she was too smart for that. Met me in person at a coffee shop. No witnesses, no paper trail. But I wanted you to know what you're dealing with. Rebecca was equally disturbed when Daniel told her. This changes things. If she's trying to bribe contractors, she's desperate. Let me dig deeper into her background. What Rebecca found was illuminating. Patricia Whitmore had been trying to buy Daniel's property for 2 years before he inherited it. She'd made offers through shell companies during the estate proceedings, lowball offers that would have let her subdivide the 2 acres into 4 lots. At current property values, that would have netted her close to $1 million in profit. But Rebecca found more. Much more. She discovered that Patricia had a pattern of using her position as HOA president to pressure people into selling their homes. She'd target properties, ramp up violations and fees, make life unbearable, and then either she or her business associates would swoop in with cash offers, usually well below market value, to owners who were desperate to escape the harassment. She's been doing this for at least 5 years, Rebecca said, spreading documents across her desk. I found 7 properties that sold under suspicious circumstances. Excessive fines, aggressive enforcement, and then sales to companies linked to Patricia or her husband. We need to talk to those former owners. They tracked down 4 of them. Each had a similar story. Sudden escalation of petty violations, mounting fines, legal threats, and eventually an offer to make it all go away, if they'd just sell. All of them had folded, taking losses on their homes just to escape the constant stress. One of them, a retired teacher named Dorothy, actually cried when Rebecca explained what had really been happening. I thought I was going crazy. They made me feel like I was the problem, like I was too difficult, too stubborn. I lost $20,000 on that house when I sold it. $20,000 I'd been saving for my grandchildren's college. Would you be willing to testify? Rebecca asked. Dorothy nodded. If it helps stop her from doing this to someone else. Absolutely. Armed with this new information, Rebecca filed a counter-lawsuit against Patricia and the HOA for harassment, abuse of power, and interference with property rights. She also requested sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. Patricia's response was immediate and vicious. She called an emergency HOA meeting and pushed through a special assessment, a one-time fee of $5,000 per household, to fund the legal battle against Daniel. Several residents protested, but she shut them down. This is about protecting all our property values, she insisted. If we let one person ignore the rules, chaos follows. Everyone pays or we'll put liens on your properties. Frank Johnson stood up. This is wrong, Patricia. You're using HOA funds to fight a personal battle. Sit down, Frank, unless you want to be next on the violation list. The threat was clear. Comply or be targeted. Most people paid the assessment, but the resentment was building. Daniel started getting quiet visits from neighbors, people who stopped by in the evening when Patricia wasn't watching. They shared stories. A couple who'd been fined for their son's basketball hoop, a man who'd been threatened over a flagpole, a woman who'd been cited for having the wrong color Christmas lights. Each story was petty on its own, but together they painted a picture of a neighborhood living in fear of their own HOA. Why doesn't anyone fight back? Daniel asked one evening when 3 neighbors were sitting in his kitchen. We tried, one woman said. 2 years ago, a group of us challenged the board elections. Patricia found violations on every single property of everyone who opposed her. She buried us in fines and legal threats until we backed down. People are afraid, Daniel. Afraid of losing their homes? That's not an HOA anymore, Daniel said. That's extortion. Tell that to the judge. He planned to do exactly that. Rebecca was building a case that went far beyond just Daniel's property rights. She was documenting a pattern of abuse that had affected dozens of families over years. But Patricia wasn't done. Her next move was calculated to hurt Daniel where he was most vulnerable, his connection to the neighborhood and his family's legacy. She organized a community beautification meeting and invited local news. Standing in front of Daniel's house, she talked about how one property owner's selfishness was affecting everyone else. She had charts showing property values in nearby neighborhoods versus Meadowbrook Heights. She had testimonials from residents who claimed they were embarrassed by the eyesore in their midst. The local news ran the story. Trobattle's homeowner overstandards read the headline. The piece made Patricia look reasonable and Daniel look stubborn and difficult. His phone rang off the hook for days. Some calls were supportive, but many were ugly. People he'd never met telling him he was ruining the neighborhood, that he should just paint the house beige and stop being difficult. It was exhausting. Daniel found himself dreading getting up each morning, wondering what harassment waited for him. His savings were dwindling as legal fees mounted. The restoration that was supposed to be a labor of love had become a nightmare. One particularly low evening, He sat on his porch with a beer, staring at the garden his mother had loved. He was tired, so incredibly tired. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he should just give up, repaint the house, pay the fines, and try to move on with his life. That's when Frank and Helen appeared at the end of his driveway. They weren't alone. Behind them were at least 20 other residents. Some he recognized from the meetings, others he'd never spoken to. Frank stepped forward. "We've been talking. About Patricia. About the HOA, about what's been happening in this neighborhood. We're tired of being afraid, Daniel. If you're willing to keep fighting, we're ready to fight with you." One by one, they came forward with their own stories, their own documentation of Patricia's abuses. They brought years of excessive fines, threatening letters, and evidence of selective enforcement. "She can't intimidate all of us," Helen said quietly. "Not if we stand together." Daniel felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone in this anymore. This wasn't just about his house or his property rights. It was about an entire community taking back control from a bully who'd been terrorizing them for years. "Then let's take her down," he said. Rebecca smiled when Daniel called her with the news. "Now we're talking. Get me everything they have. Every letter, every fine notice, every piece of documentation. We're going to bury Patricia Whitmore in her own paperwork." The fight was far from over, but for the first time since this whole mess started, Daniel felt like maybe, just maybe, they could actually win. Rebecca's office had transformed into a war room. Every available surface was covered with documents, sticky notes, and timelines. She had 2 paralegals working full-time just organizing the evidence that kept pouring in from Daniel's neighbors. "This is bigger than I thought," Rebecca said, running her hand through her hair. "We're not just documenting harassment against you anymore. We're documenting systematic abuse of power affecting at least 30 families over the past 6 years." She spread out a chart on the table. "Look at this pattern. Patricia targets a property, usually one with resale value or development potential. She ramps up violations, piles on fees, makes the owner's life hell. Then someone connected to her or her husband makes a cash offer. 7 times in 6 years it's worked. People sold at a loss just to escape." Daniel studied the chart. Each property was marked with dates, violations, fines, and eventual sale prices. The pattern was undeniable. "Can we prove she knew what she was doing? That it was intentional?" Rebecca smiled. "That's where it gets interesting. Remember those shell companies I mentioned? I had a forensic accountant trace the ownership. 3 of them list Patricia's husband as a silent partner. Another 2 have board members from the HOA as investors. They weren't even trying to hide it well. They just didn't think anyone would dig deep enough to find it. That's fraud, isn't it? At minimum, it's massive conflicts of interest and abuse of authority. At worst, it's extortion and racketeering. I've already contacted the State Attorney General's office. They're very interested in what we found." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Patricia's lawyers tried to get it delayed, but the judge denied the motion. Daniel suspected they were scrambling, realizing their intimidation tactics wouldn't work in a courtroom. The night before the hearing, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept running through everything in his mind, wondering what he'd forgotten, what could go wrong. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up and went to sit on his porch. The house looked beautiful in the moonlight. The restoration was nearly complete now. Despite everything Patricia had thrown at him, he'd managed to finish most of the work. The Victorian stood proud and distinctive, a splash of color and history in a sea of beige conformity. Frank walked over from his house across the street, apparently unable to sleep either. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Daniel. "Terrified. What if we lose? Then we appeal, and we keep fighting." "But Daniel, we're not going to lose. Not with everything Rebecca's put together. She could still win on a technicality. The law isn't always fair." Frank was quiet for a moment. "You know what Helen said the other day? She said that even if the worst happens, what you've done has already changed things. People in this neighborhood aren't afraid anymore. They're talking to each other, sharing stories, standing up. That's worth something, win or lose." Daniel nodded, though he didn't entirely believe it. He wanted justice. He wanted Patricia held accountable for everything she'd done. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Daniel had expected it to be just lawyers and a judge, but news of the case had spread. There were at least 40 residents from Meadowbrook Heights in the gallery, split roughly down the middle between those supporting Patricia and those supporting Daniel. Patricia sat at the plaintiff's table with her legal team, 3 lawyers in expensive suits. She looked confident, almost smug. Daniel sat beside Rebecca, fighting the urge to fidget. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense. This is a preliminary hearing to determine if there's sufficient cause to proceed with both the original complaint and the countersuit. Let's begin. Patricia's lead attorney stood. He was smooth, polished, exactly the kind of lawyer who made Daniel nervous. Your Honor, this case is quite simple. The defendant owns property within the boundaries of Meadowbrook Heights, a planned community with established covenants and standards. His refusal to comply with these standards is damaging property values and violating the rights of every other homeowner in the community. He pulled up photos of Daniel's house. As you can see, the property stands out dramatically from every other home in the neighborhood. This isn't about personal preference. It's about protecting the investment of hundreds of families who bought homes specifically because of the community's standards. He went on for 20 minutes, making Daniel sound like a selfish troublemaker who thought he was above the rules that everyone else followed. Then it was Rebecca's turn. Your Honor, the HOA's entire case rests on a false premise that my client's property is part of their association. It is not and never has been. She submitted the property survey, the deed, and historical documentation. This land was owned by the Chen family since 1920, 3/4 of a century before the HOA existed. The association was built around this property, not the other way around. Furthermore, she continued, we have evidence that this lawsuit is not about community standards at all. It's the culmination of a years-long harassment campaign by the HOA president, Patricia Whitmore, to force my client to sell his property. Patricia's lawyer jumped up. Objection, Your Honor, these are baseless accusations. They're not baseless, Rebecca said calmly. She submitted a thick folder of documents. These are property records showing that Mrs. Whitmore, through various shell companies, attempted to purchase my client's property at least 7 times during the estate proceedings. Each offer was significantly below market value. The judge took the folder and began reading. The courtroom was silent. Your Honor, Rebecca continued, we've also documented a pattern of similar behavior by Mrs. Whitmore against other residents. We have 7 former Meadowbrook Heights residents willing to testify that they were subjected to excessive fines and harassment by the HOA, followed by below-market offers from companies connected to Mrs. Whitmore. Patricia's face had gone white. Her lawyer was whispering urgently in her ear, but she just stared straight ahead. Rebecca submitted more documentation, financial records, email chains, testimonies from Dorothy and the other former residents. She built a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond a simple property dispute. Additionally, Your Honor, we're asking for sanctions against the HOA for filing a frivolous lawsuit. The HOA has no legitimate claim to authority over my client's property, and they knew this before filing. This suit was filed purely to harass and intimidate. The judge had been reading through the documents while Rebecca talked. Finally, she looked up. I'm going to be blunt. This is one of the most troubling cases I've seen in 20 years on the bench. Mrs. Whitmore, you and your counsel will approach the bench. Patricia and her lawyers huddled with the judge for several minutes. Daniel couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see Patricia's face getting redder. When they returned to their seats, the judge addressed the courtroom. I'm dismissing the HOA's complaint in its entirety. The evidence is clear that Mr. Chen's property is not and has never been part of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. The HOA has no standing to enforce any standards, rules, or fees against this property. Daniel felt Rebecca squeeze his arm, but he barely registered it. He was focused entirely on the judge. Furthermore, I'm granting the countersuit and scheduling a full trial to address the allegations of harassment, abuse of authority, and fraud. I'm also issuing an immediate restraining order, prohibiting Mrs. Whitmore or anyone acting on behalf of the HOA from contacting Mr. Chen or entering his property for any reason. Patricia shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is absurd. I've done nothing wrong. Mrs. Whitmore, sit down. You'll have your chance to defend yourself at T-Way. Real. But I've read enough of this documentation to have serious concerns about your conduct. The restraining order stands. The judge looked at the papers again. I'm also ordering the HOA to return all fines collected from Mr. Chen, plus attorney's fees and costs to date. The amount will be determined at the full hearing. She banged her gavel. We're adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Neighbors were hugging each other, crying, laughing. Patricia stormed out with her lawyers trailing behind her, ignoring the reporters who'd shown up hoping for a story. Daniel just sat there trying to process what had happened. They'd won. Not just won, but demolished Patricia's case so thoroughly that the judge had dismissed it outright. Rebecca was grinning. That went even better than I hoped. Did you see her face?
Is it really over?
The lawsuit against you? Yes, the investigation into Patricia? That's just beginning. With what we've uncovered, she's going to have much bigger problems than HOA business. Frank pushed through the crowd to shake Daniel's hand. You did it. You actually did it. We did it, Daniel corrected. None of this would have been possible without everyone speaking up. Over the next few days, the fallout was spectacular. Local news picked up the story, and it went regional, then national. HOA president accused of systematic harassment and fraud made headlines across the country. The story touched a nerve with people who'd had their own nightmares with HOAs. Daniel's phone rang constantly with interview requests. He declined most of them, but he did agree to talk to a reporter from the local paper who'd been covering community issues for years. Why do you think this happened? The reporter asked. Daniel thought about it. I think Patricia started with good intentions, maybe. Wanting to maintain standards, protect property values. But somewhere along the way, power corrupted her. She started seeing residents as subjects rather than neighbors. And when no one pushed back, she just kept taking more control. What's your message to other people dealing with similar situations? Document everything. Find allies. Don't be afraid to fight back. Bullies rely on people being too tired or too scared to stand up. But you're not alone, even when it feels that way. The State Attorney General's office officially opened an investigation into Patricia and the HOA board. They were looking into the shell companies, the financial dealings, and whether criminal charges were warranted. Patricia tried to hold an emergency HOA meeting to address the false accusations, but more than half the residents signed a petition demanding her immediate resignation. When she refused, they called for a special election to recall the entire board. The election wasn't even close. Patricia and her allies were voted out by a margin of 4-1. Frank was elected as the new president, with Helen and several others who'd been victims of Patricia's schemes joining the new board. Their first action was to issue a formal apology to Daniel, delivered in person by Frank. On behalf of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, we apologize for the harassment and legal action taken against you. You were right and we were wrong. Your property has never been part of this association and we have no authority over it. We hope we can be good neighbors going forward. Daniel accepted the apology. He even accepted their invitation to the neighborhood summer barbecue, though he made it clear he was attending as a guest, not a member. But there was still the matter of the full trial. Patricia had hired new lawyers and was fighting every allegation. She claimed she'd done nothing wrong, that she was being persecuted for trying to maintain community standards. The trial was scheduled for 3 months out. Rebecca was confident, but she warned Daniel it would be brutal. She's going to go after your character, your motives, everything. She'll try to make this about you being difficult and her being a victim. Are you ready for that? Daniel looked at his house, at the garden blooming with his mother's roses, at the porch where he'd spent countless evenings. He thought about Dorothy and the others who'd lost money and peace of mind to Patricia's schemes. I'm ready. Let's finish this. The trial lasted 4 days, 4 exhausting, emotionally draining days where Daniel watched Patricia's lawyers try to twist everything into a narrative where she was the hero and he was the villain. They painted him as an outsider who'd swooped in to disrupt a peaceful community. They claimed his refusal to follow reasonable standards was selfish and destructive. They brought in witnesses who testified about declining property values and neighborhood tension, carefully avoiding any mention of why that tension existed. But Rebecca was ready. She'd spent months building an airtight case and she dismantled Patricia's defense piece by piece. Dorothy took the stand first. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she was sworn in, but her testimony was powerful. She described in detail how Patricia had targeted her property with violations, fined her thousands of dollars for minor infractions, and made her life so miserable that she'd sold at a $20,000 loss just to escape. Did you know at the time that Mrs. Whitmore had a financial interest in your property? Rebecca asked. No, if I'd known I never would have sold to that company. I felt so stupid afterwards, like I'd given up too easily. But I was exhausted. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every day there was a new letter, a new fine, a new threat. I just wanted it to stop. Patricia's lawyer tried to discredit her on cross-examination, suggesting she'd been a difficult resident who'd ignored legitimate violations. But Dorothy held firm. I lived in that house for 12 years without a single complaint. Then I painted my shutters navy instead of black, and suddenly everything I did was wrong. My mailbox was crooked. My grass was too long. My garden stones weren't approved materials. It was endless. 6 more former residents testified with similar stories. The pattern was undeniable. Patricia would target a property, escalate enforcement, and then someone connected to her would benefit from the forced sale. Tom testified about Patricia's attempt to bribe him to lie about Daniel's permits. Frank and Helen testified about their vegetable garden fine and the climate of fear that had existed in the neighborhood. The financial evidence was damning. Rebecca's forensic accountant walked the jury through the shell companies, the connections to Patricia and her husband, the profits they'd made. It was all there in black and white. But the most powerful moment came when Rebecca put Daniel on the stand. "Tell the jury why you came back to this house," she said. Daniel took a breath. "It was my home. My parents built a life there. My mom spent 30 years working in that garden. My dad rebuilt the porch with his own hands. When I was a kid, that house was filled with love and laughter and family. After they passed, I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let all those memories just rot away. Why didn't you just paint it beige and follow the HOA rules? Because it's not an HOA property. It never was. And more than that, because the house deserves to be what it was meant to be. It's a Victorian from the 1920s. It was built to be colorful, to show off its architectural details. Painting it beige would be like putting a beautiful painting in a plain brown frame. It would be wrong. What did you think when Mrs. Whitmore demanded you comply with HOA standards? At first I thought it was a misunderstanding. I tried to explain, to show her the documentation. But she didn't care about the truth. She just wanted control, and when I wouldn't give it to her, she tried to destroy me. Patricia's lawyer went after him hard on cross-examination, but Daniel stayed calm. He'd lived through months of harassment. A lawyer's questions weren't going to break him. The closing arguments took most of the 4th day. Patricia's lawyer tried one last time to make this about community standards and property values, but it rang hollow against the mountain of evidence Rebecca had presented. When Rebecca stood for her closing, she was brief and direct. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't complicated. Patricia Whitmore used her position as HOA president to systematically harass and financially harm residents for personal profit. She didn't care about community standards. She cared about money and power. The evidence shows it. The victims have testified to it. Now it's up to you to hold her accountable." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Daniel paced outside the courtroom, unable to sit still. He'd put everything into this fight. Not just money, but months of his life, his peace of mind, his sense of security. If they lost now, he didn't know what he'd do. When the bailiff called them back in, Daniel's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear. The jury foreman stood. "In the matter of Chen versus Whitmore and Meadowbrook Heights HOA, we find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." Daniel felt his knees go weak. Rebecca grabbed his arm to steady him. The foreman continued reading. The jury had found Patricia guilty of harassment, abuse of authority, and fraud. They awarded Daniel full attorney's fees and costs. They awarded him damages for emotional distress. And they awarded punitive damages, a message that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The total came to just over $300,000. But more importantly, the judge issued a permanent injunction. Patricia was barred from serving on any HOA board for life. She was prohibited from contacting Daniel or any of the other victims. And the HOA was ordered to implement sweeping reforms to prevent future abuses. Patricia sat frozen at her table, her face blank. When the judge dismissed the court,